Hey geniuses, let's get started working on this higher level essay for the things they carried. Looking at 2.7 here, which is planning your higher level essay on the things they carried. And I just want to kind of walk you through this a little bit and give you some tips as you work on it. The first thing to do is to write your line of inquiry, investigate it, and create a central assertion thesis statement. That's a lot, but the good news is you have been working on this as you've been reading the book. You've been tracing a literary feature, an authorial choice, and we've been talking a lot about the meaning of this book as we've been reading. So I think this will be doable, and let's just take a look at what the directions say for us, okay? And let's see if we can have at it here. 2.7 step 1 is to write your line of inquiry, reflect on your step 1s from the 2.3 through 2.6 lessons, and write a central assertion thesis statement. So in each lesson, the first must do was to find examples of a particular authorial choice and to do some analysis and evaluation with them. So now is the time when you are going to be looking critically at how all of those work together to then create meaning. And so that's the interpretation piece. And so we have to do all three things. We have to analyze, evaluate, and interpret. And they're all important. They're all tough to do. They all take time, energy, and lots of genius brain power. So it's a good thing we are geniuses. All right, let's take a look at the directions. Answer the questions below in order to plan for the essay. The first question, reflect on one or more of the rich ideas from the book. What was O'Brien's point in the end? Give it your best guess now. As someone who read the book and did some writing and reflecting about it and talking about it, you have the ability to do this now. Give it your best guess, knowing that in the end you'll have to support whatever you say with textual evidence. But for now, best guesses are okay. And then you'll come back and look for evidence in the book as you write your essay. Okay, so let's tackle any of these questions or key themes or all of them in the space to the right, okay? The first one is, what makes this text fiction, a novel, rather than nonfiction, a memoir, and why is it difficult to tell the difference? And so if you spent some time looking at the tricks O'Brien uses to make us think that this book is nonfiction rather than fiction, this is a great question for you to answer. Now, of course, he tricks us immediately with his, I want to say inscription, but that's not right, his dedication, right? And the epigraph at the beginning of the book. But we know that the book is a work of fiction. It's titled such. And he's also written and spoken about this book as fiction and talked about how it's different from his real life. Now, something really helpful for you to look at for this is going to be the documentary called How to Tell a True War Story. And it's in 2.1. And so I would go back there if I were looking at this question and watch that. It's 30 minutes long, so it's going to take you some time to get through, but I really do think it's going to be beneficial for you. So those are some tips if you're tackling that question. How does the author trick the reader in this text and to what effect? I guess that fits with number 1, doesn't it? We've just talked about that. What is the point of telling stories if they aren't true? So here we're getting to a larger theme or meaning, and we might look down here to one of these things. Maybe the answer lies here. Story and imagination as creative forces. It's through storytelling that O'Brien is able to address some of the trauma and baggage left from the war. And we can talk about O'Brien as the character here, okay? We don't have to talk about him as the author. And so the character O'Brien certainly feels guilty, specifically for Kiowa's death, but he also feels guilty for just being part of the war. And it's through storytelling, writing the book, and also talking out some of these stories that he's able to come to terms with some of the most difficult things for him. And so it's a creative force. It not only writing, telling the story creates the book, and which is a piece of art, but it's also creative force in that it creates an opportunity for him to have relationships with other people. You know, unlike Norman Bowker, who is so isolated when he can't tell his story, O'Brien is able to talk about these things that happen, both with Lieutenant Jimmy Cross and later his daughter Kathleen, and then the various other characters in the story that he talks to. So you could think about that as you are responding to this question. How about number 4? How does the narrator use their voice to create truths? The issue that comes to mind to me automatically are the lies, right, that the narrator tells us. He makes us think, for example, that Norman Bowker is responsible for Kiowa's death in the short story Speaking of Courage. Later on, we find out in the short, did I call it a short story? Chapter, I meant, excuse me. It's a novel of chapters, not short stories. And then later in the chapter in the field, we find out, if we look really carefully and closely, that it's not Norman Bowker who is responsible for Kiowa's death, if anyone. If anyone, it is Tim O'Brien, the unnamed boy. And so he uses these stories, or he uses his voice to create truths by naming other people, by using a different narrator, a third-person omniscient limited narrator in those 2 chapters specifically, to create this truth that there's someone else responsible for the death of Kiowa, and it's not the character Tim O'Brien. In the next question, how does the fragmented and non-chronological structure of the novel complicate this text? And I think it mirrors memory, and it complicates it because in the same way that memory is not always factual, this story is not always factual, and it's not in order. And so we hear little shards of stories throughout. Go back and reread the first chapter, The Things They Carried, and you're going to read in that chapter that Kiowa died in a sewage field. And you didn't notice it because you didn't know who Kiowa was at the time, and you didn't pick up on the little details. But he does mention it right away in that first chapter, and he drops these little shards of memories throughout. And then there are other moments where the stories are fleshed out, like in Speaking of Courage and in the field, Kiowa's story is fleshed out. But what is the effect of that on the reader? Maybe we're not sure what is real and what is imagined. Maybe we are invited to create our own meaning, which in a sense is how memory works. When we remember things years later, we choose really how we remember it. And we make sense of things that happened to us in the past by recreating it in our imagination as memories now. Perhaps that's what he's doing in this book, and we're invited to do the same. In what is the impact of war on the psyche, memory, and beliefs of the soldiers in Vietnam? This one is central, of course, to the text. We see that the characters have heavy burdens. Their memories and trauma affect them. They also, in order to survive the moment, often do things that are seemingly pretty horrendous, like killing a baby water buffalo, or some of the other things like that. By the end of the book, we see a lot of detachment, where characters are sort of removing themselves from their feelings and from really their own personhood. And so there are lots of consequences. We see characters, too, who also can't survive in life after the war. Norman Bowker takes his own life, tragically, after we hear about him in the chapter Speaking of Courage. And, you know, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross is never able to have a relationship with Martha, you know, and maybe all of his relationships are going to be affected by that. So you can start thinking about some of those consequences as well. The key themes: the power of voice to create truths, the burden of war stories, innocence, guilt, and redemption, and story and imagination as creative forces. Now, there is a video where I go through these 4 themes and I talk about just how they're interesting in and of themselves, and it's in 2.2. So go back and take a look at that video about theme if you feel like you need some help understanding what these are. Okay, so after you've, you can pause it now and do some responding to number 1. After looking at number 1, take a look at number 2. How does the rich idea connect to the literary aspect or authorial choice that you traced in the book in your step 1s? And so there are the different authorial choices. Now, if you didn't find a whole lot of examples at this point, it's okay. It really is. I don't want you to feel bad about that or scared or anything. Now is the time to do it, okay? Oftentimes that's how we read books. We read for plot and character, and then we go back and we look at style and authorial choice. And so that's perfectly normal. There will be some tips in Schoology with these, so you can look at those. You can look at the discussion questions. There are some tips there. And I also did make a video about authorial choices. Actually, I think it's in 2 parts. It's a 2-part video, and that is in 2.2 as well. So use those to help you think about how these are connected. Sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're less obvious how the authorial choices connect to theme. But just spend some time just putting pencil to paper right now. What is your best guess? Pause the video and respond to number 2. All right, number 3 is write your line of inquiry to the right. And your line of inquiry needs to include these 7 components, right? You know the author, the text, the genre. You know the literary aspect or authorial choice. You know the rich idea. That's what you just wrote about above. And you know the precise context. The precise context is 20th century, right? It was published in 1990 in the U.S. So you could say contemporary American literature, modern American literature, postmodern America, war in the 20th century. Any of those kinds of things would be appropriate for the precise context. So for the literary aspect authorial choice, please use whatever it is you traced throughout the book. For the rich idea, you're going to use the theme or maybe an answer to one of these essential questions, up here, okay? So you can do this right now. Just give it a shot. You're just asking a question. That's all you're doing with this, okay? Here's our sample. How and to what effect does Ariel Dorfman's characterization of Paulina in the play Death and the Maiden illustrate the struggle for freedom in a post-dictatorship? So yours might sound something like, how and to what effect does Tim O'Brien's use of weight and things carried as a motif in the novel, The Things They Carried, illustrate the effects and burden of war stories in a postmodernist novel? No, we shouldn't say postmodernist novel. How about in contemporary American or to a contemporary American audience? There we go. I'm sorry, it took me a bit to get to the precise context. To a contemporary American audience. Or if contemporary feels not quite right, to a 20th century American audience. All right. Then you're going to look for the best example from the beginning of the book that connects directly to the line of inquiry. Include the quote and explain how it connects. Find the best example from the middle of the book, do the same, and find the best from the end of the book and do the same. All right, use what you took notes on already. Use the documents that are in Schoology that are there to help you, and fill that in right now. Okay, now it's time to turn your line of inquiry into a thesis statement by answering the question with a debatable assertion. And now you're going to make sure you have all 4 components: genre, author with name of text, literary aspect, and rich idea. And it's okay if your thesis statement changes a little bit, if what you have right now is different from what you end up turning in, that's fine. Just think of this as your first try at it, and you may very well make some changes, okay? So here's an example. In the ancient Greek tragedy Medea, Euripides utilizes the motif of poison to illustrate Medea's role as an other who is outside of the Greek society of the 5th century BC. And so an example for the things they carried might be something like, in the postmodernist novel, The Things They Carried, Tim O'Brien utilizes the motif of weight and things carried to illustrate the effect, the burdensome effect of war stories to a 20th century American audience. Or you could say on contemporary soldiers, or on soldiers in the Vietnam War in the 20th century. Okay, so those are some ideas, and take a look at the documents in Schoology to help you, and you got this. You know you do.